Hello and welcome to Analog Insights. In today's episode, I take a closer look at the Leica II or Model D, an early Oscar Barnack Leica that was produced from 1932 onwards and already came with an integrated rangefinder, the standard flange distance that makes it possible to mount Leica thread mount lenses, and the so-called fast shutter speeds of 1/500th of a second all the way down to 1/20th of a second. And as such, it arguably represents the nucleus of what would make Leica cameras so successful, and of course it also has quite some historical significance. The Leica II was built simultaneously to the Leica III all the way up to 1948. And in the 17 years of production run, it only saw some slight mechanical improvements. And of course, this makes this camera also particularly interesting to me. Why on earth would you buy a 90-year-old camera? I have 4 reasons. The first one is it is a visually appealing design. This camera here comes in a black enamel, black paint version with nickel lens and controls. It's really nice. And as you know, black Leica cameras and black Leica bodies, especially the M bodies, have become prohibitively expensive. And here, looking at the Oscar Barnacks, it's still more affordable. You of course pay a premium for the black versions, and yet in the case of the Leica II, these are much more widely available and can be purchased until today. The second reason is that it comes with a very simple but sufficient functionality, and the camera always reminds me of Dieter Rams' famous saying, less but better. So to me, it represents a stripped down version of a camera, everything you need. There are no slower shutter speeds. There are 2 different windows, one for focusing and one for composition, and so on. There are many things that slow you down, but at the same time, it has everything you need to take a photograph, and it's really a joy using it. Then, of course, you have historical relevance as the first Leica model to come with an integrated rangefinder. And this, of course, is an important step that arguably laid the foundation for the success of later Leica M cameras and Leica cameras in general. And having a built-in coupled rangefinder, of course, made the camera significantly more useful and interesting. In the past, as you can imagine, it was necessary to have a dedicated rangefinder on top of it, or just guess the distance, and now you have it integrated. It is also the first camera with the famous or legendary engraving Leica Ernst Leitz Wetzlar DRP on the top plate, and of course that's also beautiful to look at. And last but not least, this is a pretty light and compact camera. It is smaller and more compact than the Leica M6 here, for instance. Of course, the M6 has much more features, but many people tend to forget that. So this original Oscar Barnack design was really built around the 35mm film roll, and had the whole point was to make it as small and as compact as possible. And it's quite an achievement to see what was already possible back then. And it is really comparable to small compact designs that we saw later again in the 1960s and 70s, of course, with much more features built in there. But if it's important to you to have a lightweight and compact design, then this here is really interesting with just about around 400 grams and still a lot of durability and a nice sturdy design. I took the camera with me on several trips in the last year or so, shooting it in cities like Paris and Berlin, and also recently in Shanghai and Beijing, and really taking the camera through its paces and trying how it would perform with classic black and white film. But also I was curious to see how this original 50mm LMR lens would perform with Kodak Gold 200 film, especially since it's mostly basically uncoated. I was curious to see how it would render colors and how it would come out. As always, these films were developed and scanned by my trusted On Film Lab in Frankfurt, and I can't wait to share the results here with you. To me, the Leica II is a true gentleman's camera, and in many ways is a quiet and subtle camera, while at the same time offering superb quality. At least to my eyes, some of the images that I got out of it, it was not possible to see that these are coming out of a 90-year-old camera. So without further ado, let's take a closer look at the Leica II. The Leica II was introduced in 1932 and built on the success of the Leica I, released in 1925. For the very first time, it came with an integrated rangefinder, and that was, of course, quite a game changer because people were used to either zone focusing, kind of guessing the distance to the subject, or having a dedicated accessory to measure the distance to the subject and then set it on the lens itself. And here you have a camera with two different windows. One is the viewfinder, a standard 50mm one, and then the other one is a 1.5 times magnified rangefinder to get the focusing as correctly as possible, with a little patch here in the center. As in Leica aficionado terms, this camera is also called the Model D because we're kind of counting the different models. The standard would be the Model E and so on. So this one is the Model D, or Leica II, and it comes or is made with a vulcanite covered metal body and is available in either the black enamel that we can see here or a silver chrome finish. And interestingly, out of the 36,936 black cameras that were produced, the majority was produced in 1932, and the chrome version only started a year later and saw more consistent production numbers to a total of 15,573. And this is interesting because it's unusual to have more black cameras of a Leica than silver chrome versions. Sometimes they're even incredibly rare, like in the case of the Leica M3 and other models later on. So here for the Leica II, it's different, it's the other way around, and especially early ones can be had in black as well, which is interesting for collectors. My serial number here indicates that my camera with the nickel controls and the black enamel was made in 1935. The camera represents a nucleus of what made Leica so successful. As I've mentioned before, a little bit more in detail, it supported the 35mm format that was already popularized for still photography with the Leica I. It came with the Leica thread mount that was also made possible thanks to new machining available at the time, so that it could be produced consistently. It came with a new standard flange distance that made sure that different lenses can be mounted and also focus correctly at infinity. It hence supported interchangeable lenses and became one of the first system cameras where you had interchangeable lenses, but then also if you didn't mount a 50mm lens that kind of fit the built-in viewfinder, you of course could also buy accessory viewfinders and put them on top. Back then, Leica already had lenses ranging from 35mm all the way up to 135mm, so quite the system, quite interesting. And it came, as I've mentioned, with that built-in rangefinder with a 1.5 magnification that became the standard further down the road. And as briefly mentioned in the introduction, it also came suddenly with that now famous engraving that is still around more or less in a similar fashion, saying Leica on the top plate and then Ernst Leitz Wetzlar. And back then it was still DRP, which stands for Deutsches Reichspatent, which just was the standard for patents before May 1945. And it is likely referencing the German patent number 384071 that was granted to Ernst Leitz for the Rollfilm camera on November 3rd, 1923. This one is arguably the first Oscar Barnack camera that can be easily used also from today's perspective, or where you don't have so many compromises in using them. The Model E, the standard, is kind of similar, but this one here is particularly easy and already comes with that built-in integrated rangefinder. And the camera also comes with a focal plane shutter with shutter speeds between 1/500th of a second and 1/20th of a second, plus a bulb mode, which in this case is indicated here with a Z or Z for German Zeit, which basically means time. So in the time mode, you basically have a bulb mode. And the shutter works by delaying the speed between a first blind and then a second blind. And when pressing the shutter release button, And when advancing the film, it is important to note that all these dials here on top are moving. So especially in colder weather, when you're using a glove, it's important not to interfere with all the movements, because when turning the advance knob here, basically you're cocking the shutter and you're also advancing the film. And because the shutter is being cocked, you can see that here with the turning shutter speed dial. The button layout is very simple. You have this beautiful shutter release button with a rounded top. So in this case, it's not possible, it's not threaded, it's not possible to have a soft release integrated here, but it's already a very soft, rounded shutter release button that personally I really like. Then you have the choice between an advance mode with A for advancing the film and a rewind mode with the R here for rewinding the film. And then you have a very prominent advance knob instead of a lever for advancing the film. And there's also an auto stop once the film has been advanced by a frame, and again the shutter is cocked. The rewind knob can be pulled out to rewind the film once you have set the camera to the R mode, and around the film advance knob is a manual frame counter that can be set similar to the Leica II much later. On the back of the camera, you see the two eyepieces that I've touched on before with a certain distance. The difference here is in the later Leica III models, at one point they were really put close together, like in one integrated view element basically, and it was very easy to switch between the two, and here you still had it with a little bit of a distance in between. The bottom features a tripod mount and an opening key to remove the bottom plate to load the film, and there's one trick for loading the film that is very important and that I will discuss in a minute. The small dimensions and the collapsibility of the standard 50mm LMR lens here make this camera incredibly small and easy to pocket. The Leica II came without any kind of strap eyelets, so you either need to hold the camera in your hand or use a dedicated case for it. I would not advise to customize the camera and add the eyelets. Some people do that, but I prefer just using it with either the original, one of the original cases that I got in my particular case via the Leica store in the Bergener Straße here in Munich, or I got a case, an additional one from my favorite Taiwanese seller of such cases, which really snuggles nicely into place, is a little bit more compact, and then it also comes with dedicated eyelets where you can then attach any kind of third-party neck strap or wrist strap or whatever you prefer. So sometimes I just like carrying the camera to protect the vulcanite, but sometimes I also put it in one of these cases here. So what about the image quality and results? My camera here came with the standard 50mm Elmar f3.5 lens made of nickel. And this was the lens commonly presented or sold with the Leica II. So it's quite the standard lens, and it is known for its stabilized aperture, which is interesting, and the collapsible design. So you really need to turn it or pull it out and then turn it to fix it in place. And what is also important to mention are these unusual f-stops here, at least from today's perspective. So the minimum aperture, for instance, would be f18, and then there are certain steps in between. And it's also interesting to set, since it's a stepless aperture and you need either the tip of your finger or a fingernail to go in here and then manipulate it, and also takes a moment longer. And the unusual steps also fit the shutter speeds here of the Leica II, of course, with the 1/200th of a second, for instance, that was then later changed and updated to the then more common speeds that we still have today, like 1/250th of a second, 1/25th of a second, and so on. Back to the lens here. This is an uncoated lens. At least the early 1930s LMRs were uncoated, and this one here is certainly a pre-war version. It's not in perfect condition, but it's perfectly fine. And I was honestly surprised to see the results that I got out of it here. My expectation was that I can certainly see that this is taken, or the images are taken with a 90-year-old lens or camera, and it turned out not to be the case. I saw pretty good results with sharpness across most of the frame, hardly any vignetting or strong fall off or so on, even when shooting the lens wide open. It is a really strong performer at f3.5 already, and then of course has a sweet spot at f8, I would say. It performs really, really nicely. Sharpness is significant. It's of course not the same amount of detail and resolution that we would have with a modern lens, but it's perfectly sufficient, and some images really, really surprised me. Also when it comes to the bokeh at closer distances, you really have a nice bokeh and smooth foreground background transition, and overall I got just really nice clean images that I wouldn't have guessed coming out of such an old camera and lens. Shooting against the light, you immediately see the lack of coating here. I saw some ghosting and flaring and the typical effects that you would expect. Shooting it on color film was of course particularly interesting, especially in Shanghai here. I got really, really interesting results. And when it comes to my black and white images, I was surprised to see so much micro contrast and such a remarkable amount of clarity in the images. And to me, it is also a characteristic look, precisely because of that lack of coating, that some street photographers also are seeking and looking for, and they like that glowy atmosphere. And of course there are lenses that are even glowing more and have more of these aberrations and spherical aberrations, and this LMR here is pretty well corrected for such an early 1930s lens. As briefly touched on before, this is a camera that is really a system camera, so you could also shoot a 35mm Summron or MR or whatever with it, and just go in different directions with an additional viewfinder. I preferred shooting it with this particular one here, and got really, really nice results. So what about the handling and my personal impressions? The most important point of concern is typically how to load film correctly with these Oscar Barnack Leicas. And many people struggle a lot, to be honest, with that, and also end up selling the camera again because they don't understand it, or they have trouble loading it. They might even damage the camera in the process. There are certain tricks out there of putting it into bulb mode and so on, and fumbling around with the camera. At the end of the day, it is not that complicated. All you have to do is to extend the thin part of your film leader by 13 perforations. And the way I typically do that is I get a pair of nail scissors, sit down with the roll, pull it out a little bit, and then on the shorter part of the film leader, I count 13 perforations and then count out that part to make sure that the thin part, the smaller part, so to speak, is extended by 13 perforations, and then I pull out 2 more perforations without cutting into them, and leave them fully exposed there. And taking that now and putting it into the camera works perfectly fine. You will immediately see, okay, you just put it in, you put down the bottom plate, and you start advancing it, pressing your shutter release, advancing again, and then at some point you will see the right side turning as well, and that means it's the message, it's engaging properly, it's working as intended, and you're good to go. And that's it. There are different ways of doing that. I personally prefer the nail scissor version and counting it myself. There's also the original Ablon equipment piece, which is relatively expensive, which is at the end of the day nothing else but a cutting guide from Leica to help you cut it correctly. And of course, there are inexpensive 3D printed alternatives out there, for instance, by the manufacturer Ausgeknipst. And I've tried those before and was not really happy because I ended up with a cutting knife cutting into the 3D printed parts and not really, it didn't really serve well as a cutting guide, to be honest. And I would not recommend these, and instead just counting it for yourself and extending it by the perforations that you need. The 13 is the magic number, and then you're good to go. But most problems with these cameras really derive from not cutting the film properly and encountering these problems. It's of course not as straightforward as with the Leica M cameras, especially with the quick load system later on. But at the end, if you know how to do it, it is also not that difficult because you're not really fumbling around with much. The only thing that you need to understand are these perforations and then putting it onto the additional roll here that you have and then putting it back in. You're good. From a visual perspective, I really enjoyed the nickel controls here on my camera and how they develop a beautiful patina over time. This is something that is hard to bring across in video because it really changes depending on the light. As you know, black cameras in general are heavily sought after. Personally, I also really like that black enamel finish here and the reflections that you get, the Leica engraving here with the script on top. This is just so beautiful and so classy to me. This is also why I'm claiming it's a true gentleman's camera to me. It is turning heads. Certainly people are looking, what kind of camera do you have here? What interesting thing is it? And not just among Leica shooters, but also among just regular people on the street. It is something unusual, similar to a Rolleiflex, I would say, but even more so because people see it's a Leica, it's interesting, and so on. The mechanical quality of this camera is outstanding and it can still be repaired until today. But of course, when looking at the market, it's also important to look for some that have been CL8, that are in a proper condition, where the vulcanite is still okay, or where you feel like, okay, I could replace it myself. It's almost impossible to find cameras that have never been serviced or touched in the course of their lifespan, and as a result of that, some of course don't have all the original parts anymore, so that is really important to you. And if you're looking for original cameras from first owners and so on, this is really difficult. You know my personal family story with one of my Leica IIIs that I have, that was really inherited basically from a first and second owner that are all in the family, and that is really difficult to find. You can still find a Leica II in that way, but it's becoming naturally increasingly rare. In my case, I consulted a good friend of mine from one of the Leica stores here in Munich, and he was kind enough to take a look at the offering that I was looking at on eBay in this particular case before taking the plunge. And he recommended getting additional images of the shutter curtain, and in this case I got those additional images, and it was a new shutter curtain without any kind of holes in it and so on, because this is a common weakness that over time, of course, the shutter curtain wears down or wears out, and then it would have to be replaced. And in my case, I got a brand new one, and this was one of the reasons why I jumped at the opportunity. Back then when I bought it, it was 700 euros for a black enamel version from 1935 with fitting nickel controls and lens and so on, and that felt like a good deal. It appears to be, it still is. And as I said, this camera can be found still in relatively large quantities and numbers, and you can either go for ones in the Leica Classic store. They sometimes show up even in the Lights Photographica auctions, they sometimes show up, but then also on eBay from trusted sellers. This is not the kind of camera I would buy at a really low price from unofficial sellers, but as I've mentioned before, if you really want to make a bargain, you can still go for the silver chrome finished ones. In my opinion, these are also very beautiful, and I had to pull myself back occasionally when I saw a really good deal, because they're really beautiful as well, and they would complement my collection here nicely, because, as I've mentioned before, you have this very clean front, you have nothing on there, no self-timers, no additional slower speed dials and so on. So visually they are really appealing, and you also have these beautiful backs with only the two eyepieces, and then that's it. So in my opinion, these are one of the most visually appealing cameras that Leica ever made, and in combination with that less but better design philosophy and Dieter Rams I'm personally very much drawn to them. What is also important to mention is the versatility of the Leica thread mount. These cameras here already come with the Leica thread mount, so you can tap into all the legendary Leica lenses from the 1950s and 60s that are already coated, multi-coated and so on, and perform incredibly well even from today's perspective. So you can get Summicron lenses, Elmar lenses, Sumarons and so on that have already been built for the Leica M mount and for the Leica thread mount, and you just go for the Leica thread mount versions and you're perfectly good. You get great results and can use that lens. Or, and this is the incredible and remarkable thing about the Leica thread mount, you could also tap into modern lenses produced by Light Lens Lab or similar manufacturers, Vogtländer, and still use that with a modern rendering on that particular 1930s camera. And that I find personally quite remarkable and really, really nice. The controls are wonderfully simple and straightforward to use. I also like this A mode and R mode, and how all the dials are turning when I'm advancing here the film and cocking the shutter again and so on. It's a joy to look at that and to see all the gears kind of turning and working. And even kind of rewinding the film is a joy to do that. Of course, it takes a little bit more time, but it gives you that kind of feeling that Leica also tried to retain in some of their modern cameras, of course, and turning that knob and feeling how the film is being rewinded is a joy as well. So overall, it's a very nice haptic experience. As I often mentioned, it slows you down, but in a very, very good way. If you are curious about a classic Leica camera, a classic rangefinder in black without unnecessary features and without complexities, the Leica II certainly delivers. What I've touched on before is that it's like a time capsule that you access in many ways, and at the same time you get a camera that is smaller and lighter than a modern Leica MP or a Leica M3 or Leica M6. So if you compare them here side by side, it's still remarkable. I started measuring it myself because I found it so curious what an effect it makes when holding these cameras in your hands. The M6 feels really bulky and heavy with its, 585 gram versus the 406 gram here on the Leica II. And here also it's, I think, only 30 millimeters thick, the Leica II, and 67 millimeters tall and 133 millimeters wide, versus the M3 is a little bit thicker at 33.5 millimeters, certainly taller at 77 millimeters, and even a little bit wider at 138 millimeters. And I found that remarkable to see that distance and to feel it in my hands and what an effect it has. So it is a great camera that is a joy to use and that can be used for quick street shots that have aids kind of guessing the distance, or that can also be used for shooting portraits with a 1.5 times magnification that was recommended to me by my friend from the Leica store to just give it a try with a 90 millimeter lens. This is an important trick. I haven't done that so far, but I'm really, really curious to give that a try. And then just using the rangefinder view image, and the magnification is roughly representing the 90 millimeter focal length, and then you basically have both of them integrated here and can use the camera. It's more similar to a Leica M body. So overall, a really, really interesting camera that is, I think, not talked about much or enough, in my opinion. So, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Analog Insights and my passionate appeal to take a look at the Leica II. To me, one of the most remarkable Leica cameras ever made. It really stands out. It has historical significance. It has a beautiful reduced design that really lives up to the less but better credo by Dieter Rams. And to me, it is a true gentleman's camera that perfectly fit the vibe of Paris or a city like Beijing or Berlin. And just taking it out on the streets and running a roll of film through it is such a joy, especially with all the original pieces like the 50mm Elmar that it came with. I hope you enjoyed this review. If you did, please remember to like it and maybe even share it with your friends. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to the channel. Jules, Greg, and I really appreciate each and every subscriber coming our way. So thanks for watching. I hope to see you soon. Bye.